Each time I see a little girl of 5 or 6 or 7, I can't resist a joyous urge to smile and say thank heaven. For little girls, get bigger every day. Thank heaven.
Who knew
For little girls, they grow up in the most delightful way.
Anyway,
Those little
there's
eyes
Marie
so
Chevalier,
helpless and
most
appealing.
famous
One day will flash and send you.
for singing that song. Okay, so we're finishing. We're going to finish up a little more on Guy de Maupassant, and I brought in the last of the wine from last week. This is from the Lodi Valley. It hasn't gotten any better in the past week, but I need to. I'm trying to live up to our great, our great stage, our great stage presentations of the past few weeks with a glass of wine. I wanted to say just a few more things about de Maupassant because I kind of went on to a big reading jag with him this past few weeks, and whenever I start reading Maupassant, I read him. I can't stop reading him for quite a while, and I wanted to talk about a few things because we didn't really get a chance to talk about a number of things. So first of all, I didn't really kind of describe any of the stories. I don't like the people who tell this. I don't like to hear people summarize stories. But I thought I would give you the setup for some of these stories because it is sort of one of the most fascinating. He just can really get you from the opening paragraph. And even if he takes his time, at the longest, he might take a little time setting up an anecdote. But usually he grabs you really quick. And some of these stories, the ones that come to mind, I mean, we described a couple of them last week. The most famous story that he wrote, the one that you may have read, and which is in every boring anthology of short stories, is called The Necklace. And this is, I'll tell you this one, because it has a kind of a quote, surprise ending. The Necklace is about a woman who borrows a friend's fancy necklace so she can go to some middle-class ball. All these people are like pretentious middle-class people in Paris, and they try to look better than they are, and that always leads to bad things in Maupassant stories. And this woman goes off, and they lose this diamond necklace, and she feels so guilty. She buys a replacement for the necklace, and then spends her life repaying that necklace, only to find out, surprise, at the end, that the necklace was actually a cheap cosmetic jewelry. She didn't know the good from the bad. It's a good story. It's a perfectly good story, but it's kind of famous because it has a surprise ending. It really kind of winds you up and then really hits you. And it misinforms or missuggests that Maupassant was a surprise ending writer. He's not a surprise ending writer. His endings are great, but The Necklace is quite an unusual story. There's another story of his which I love much more, and I got to see if I can remember the title. Ooh, I don't know that I can. It's the story where a man's wife. I gotta look. Oh, I think it's 111. I think it's the Jewels. A man has a wife who I believe it's the Jewels, and it's in this collection, and it's in most of the collections, I think. A man has this wife who's very pretty, who he really loves, but she's obsessed with her cheap jewelry. And she's always coming home with what he thinks are these cheap jewels, and that she bought like at some five and dime store or something like that. And the young wife dies very young, and the husband's left very bereft and lonely and sad. And he needs money. He's really broke because all these people are broke. And through some accident, he takes some of the jewels into some pawnbroker, thinking he'll get like 10 francs for them. And it turns out they're really valuable jewels. And what's suggested is that this wife has been running off with with wealthy men while they were married and bringing these jewels home. And the husband with the dead wife, from that point on, the story, it's not a surprise ending because the story continues through to a perfect kind of satisfying ending, which is that the guy kind of lives a nice life on the strength of these jewels that were earned possibly by his dead wife. There's so many great stories. I just picked up this one. I always like to read a couple of different translations. This is David Coward's translation. There's 2 volumes in the old Oxford paperbacks. Shepherd's Leap has a character in it. It's very. These are like 4 to 5 page stories, and they just reverberate in your life forever, about some minister who hates the idea of sex. Anytime he sees an image of it, like he sees a pig giving birth, and he sees children watching the pig giving birth, he gets enraged. He just gets angry at the idea of sex, and it's a kind of a horrific and funny and tragic little story. Two Friends is a famous one about, you probably know Two Friends. It's another story that keeps showing up in anthologies. There's one in here. There's one in here called Call It Madness. No. There's one about a guy who gets up in the middle of the night, and all his furniture gets up out of the house and marches out. There's several fantastic stories in Maupassant, which is what I do love about him. He shifts around quite a bit in his narratives, and he does do a lot of fantastic stories, as we talked last week, such as the Horla, which we talked about too. That's a kind of vampire story, and it's just a brilliant story. And the long one is better than the short one that's in this collection. So I read a few other things this week. I'd never read Pierre Jean, and it's one of his short novels. I love Bellamy, and many people consider this his best novel, and it's his most low-key novel. And again, the setup is great. It starts off great. Every one of his stories just starts with a bang, and it's about another middle-class family, boring, pretentious, not boring, but a boring, self-involved father who just wants to go fishing, and a wife who used to be pretty and is still sort of pretty, and these two boys, Pierre and Jean. And at the beginning of the story, they receive word that their neighbor, an old man who used to live next door to them, has died, and he's left all his money to the youngest son, Jean. And he left all his money to him. And very quickly, what becomes apparent to everybody except the father, who's too stupid to recognize anything or to care, is that this man who died was actually the lover of the mother. And so it leads to a kind of, it's a very reflective novel. It's a little slow. It's very well written, as like everything of Maupassant's, and it's really worth reading. And it reminds me a little bit of some many Simenon thrillers. And what happens to the two boys and the two young men, and how they deal with this gradual realization that their mother, who they love, has been sleeping around. All right, so really good. I wanted to say a few more things. One of the things about Maupassant that's interesting is we all know him, and we know him because of these kind of cheesy stories, like The Necklace, which is not his best story, but it's clever, and we get these kind of misimpressions of him. And all the great writers of that time really admired him. He was very popular at the time. He sold lots of stories. He was published in all these important magazines. He made a living off writing mainly stories and a few novels, and died young, as we mentioned, of syphilis. And a lot of kind of rumors spread around about him and what kind of person he was. But many writers loved him. There's some great collections. This is a kind of a brilliant book to have. It's called Documents of Modern Literary Realism. Don't take this to the bathtub. But it's filled with interesting essays, and it contains Tolstoy's essay about Maupassant, who he admired a lot. Flaubert admired him. Zola admired him. Henry James. I don't take Henry James too seriously very often, but he's definitely right about Maupassant, and he admired him a great deal. And they all kind of thought this was his best novel. I don't necessarily agree. Finally, a couple more things to say. I finished with great enjoyment the Stig Muller biography of Maupassant. Beautifully written, beautifully put together. Definitely a biography to take in the bathtub. He's got a good eye. He reads the stories really carefully. He uses documentary materials pretty well. And at the end of the book, there's even some 4 very short stories, very kind of mediocre, moderate, average stories, or maybe less than average stories of Maupassant that had not been translated at this time. And they're all good. Even his mediocre stuff, his lowest stuff, his least satisfactory stuff is usually fun to read. He makes a couple of interesting points in this that I liked a lot. One, there's a big argument. You'll often see the argument to this day that Maupassant wrote one of his most famous stories, The Horla, about a vampire who drinks milk out of your glass and He stands behind the guy and reads books while he's reading books. It's a brilliant story. And the man may be going mad, or there may well be a vampire out there. Many people have read this and to this day, as a symptom of Maupassant's mental illness from the syphilis. And his mind was breaking down, and that these were delusions that he was transcribing. That's a really kind of infuriating theory, I think, because the Horla is actually a beautifully put together story, much like all of Maupassant's fantastic stories, because he wrote several ghost stories and several fantastic stories. And I've always thought it was a bit derisory, the notion that a great writer would write a fantastic story or a vampire story as part of his general interest, and that there must have been something wrong with him to do this. And I do think it kind of leads to that. That's sort of the conclusion these people are reaching. Stig Muller really sensibly takes that argument apart 70 years ago, and people still seem to say these things about the Horla. He makes a really strong argument that the story is just a really great story, and people should not consider it a symptom of a problem in Maupassant. He says something else in there, which I don't know if it's true or not. He's very down. Stig Muller, who I normally really like, he's down on the last two Maupassant novels. He claims that that Maupassant is heading towards a more genial approach to the upper crust, the upper classes of society, something that was in Maupassant's blood philosophically and intellectually, but at the same time, Stig Muller really doesn't like these books. In fact, I think he pretty much says they're horrible. So anyway, I've heard mixed reviews of those two books, and we need to read those in the bathtub soon. Okay, I think that's all the most important stuff I wanted to say. I love the Stig Muller. I'll say it one last time. I won't summarize any more of these great stories, but I do think I'm enjoying this. I enjoy both the books, but I'm enjoying this translation a little bit more. So that's just my personal, uninformed opinion. All right, so we'll say goodbye to de Maupassant for a while, and we'll talk about we'll come back to America next week. Okay, bye.